I'm starting a series where I'm going to talk about the history of single-handedly probably the most successful rock band of all time, the Beatles. So I'm going to be starting with their early days from 1957 when they formed to 1963. This is going to be a multi-part series. Let's get started. The Beatles, like many teenage bands, formed without any fanfare. The band was formed by John Lennon in 1957 under the moniker the Blackjacks, who would shortly become the Quarrymen before they performed their first gig in public. The name was inspired by his school, Quarry Bank High School. With a few friends, he began playing rock and roll and skiffle music to small groups. Musically, Lennon was inspired by his mother Julia, who taught him basic chords, banjo tuning for his guitar, and several songs. The Quarrymen had no notable originals as they mostly played popular covers of that time, as many small up-and-coming groups did. Paul McCartney met with Lennon in what can only be described as fate when he attended a church party wherein Quarryman Ivan Vaughan introduced the two. Lennon was impressed when McCartney showed him how to properly tune a guitar and sang songs by Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, and Little Richard. John and fellow bandmate Pete Shotton discussed adding McCartney to their band, with John's fear of being overshadowed by Paul's talent almost stopping the endeavor before it started. Man, imagine if Paul McCartney would have never joined the Beatles. That'd be weird. In July, Paul was invited into the band when Pete saw him cycling, and McCartney came on as the rhythm guitarist. The name The Quarrymen, as you can guess, did not stay for long, and while the band was skipping between drummers, they went under the name Johnny and the Moondogs. Every time I hear Johnny and the Moondogs, I always imagine one of those Fallout posters from the video games where that one guy is standing there with the gun, and there's those dogs behind him. I don't know, that's what I always thought of. Before the future Beatles became a household name, they were the local stars of a small nightclub in their hometown of Liverpool, the Cavern Club. Now, as Beatle fans, you've probably heard of that place before because it was pretty much their stomping grounds, except for when they went to Hamburg. Although exact dates are not known, it is believed that the band began playing the club on August 7th of 1957. They got the gig due to the band's manager and John Lennon's school friend Nigel Wally, who played golf with the then-owner Alan Snyder. Snyder had heard them play before and took the offer. Their first performance at the club went worse than one would expect for a band that would eventually become the Beatles. They played a set of Come Go With Me by the Del Vikings, followed by Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes, Elvis numbers. Upon reading their next request, they found the slip to say, "Cut out the bloody rock and roll," given by Snyder himself. Paul McCartney could not attend the gig, as at that time he was at scout camp with his brother, so he had yet to prove his weight in the band. McCartney's debut, however, would come on October 18th at a rock and skiffle event in New Columber Hall in Norris Green, Liverpool. To those who only know the Beatles as the Beatles might find it surprising to see McCartney on lead guitar, as later he would adopt the now famous Hofner 501 bass, which I am planning on making a video on in the near future. He had been given the role of lead guitarist for the song, as in rehearsals he could easily play the instrumental, but when the time came to play his part, he ruined the solo. Things were going fine, but when the moment came in the performance, I got sticky fingers. I thought, what am I doing here? I was just too frightened. It was too big a moment with everyone looking at the guitar player. I couldn't do it. That's why George was brought in. The next notable addition to the ragtag bunch was George Harrison, who at the point of arrival in the group was just shy of 15. George's audition for joining is amusing, as it took place on top of a double-decker bus where he rocked out to Bill Justice's Raunchy. Although impressed at Harrison's perfect cover of the song, Lennon was hesitant to allow such a young player into the group, with Paul adding on in the Beatles' self-written book anthology, "It seemed an awful lot at the time. If we wanted to do anything grown-up, we worried about George looking young. We thought, he doesn't shave, can't we make him look like a grown-up?" And in typical Lennon fashion, John remarked, "George looked even younger than Paul, and Paul looked about 10 with his baby face." Due in part to his connection to McCartney, who he was schoolmates and close friends with, as well as his remarkable skill with the guitar, knowing more chords than Lennon and McCartney, a large selling point to the band at that time, and maybe a little bit of Harrison mojo, he was formally invited into the group. As original compositions went, the band was lacking, though it was not much of an issue, as in the live circuit, originals were not necessary. On July 12th, they recorded In Spite of All the Danger and a Buddy Holly cover, That'll Be the Day. The B-side, In Spite of All the Danger, was the only pre-Beatles, as well as Beatles song credited to McCartney-Harrison. Paul said in the complete Beatles recording sessions, "It says on the label that it was me and George, but I think it was actually written by me, and George played the guitar solo. Because George did the solo, we figured that he, quote, wrote the solo." Pressed on a 78 RPM 10-inch aluminum and acetate disc, the record cost the band 17 shillings and 3 pence, which is about $42.40 today, if my math is correct. This recording session took place on July 14, 1958, according to the plaque on the front wall of the house it was recorded in, though the date has been disputed between the bandmates. The original cost could not be paid upfront by the band, who had only 15 shillings available, and when they did pay the fee to have it pressed, they shared it between themselves. When we got the record, the agreement was that we would have it for a week each. John had it a week and passed it on to me. I had it for a week and passed it on to George, who kept it for a week. Then Colin had it for a week and passed it to Duffalo, who kept it for 23 years. In 1981, McCartney bought it back from Lau for an unknown cost, but it is known to be over £5,000, as Lau has said to have rejected that amount. Paul had several more copies pressed as the material the original was pressed in wears down easily. The song will occasionally see the sun, however, as Paul will periodically play it in shows. The next day, John Lennon's world changed. His mother, Julia Lennon, who had given custody of her son to his aunt and uncle, was visiting as she did almost every day on July 15, 1958. When she was walking to the bus stop, she was hit by a car driven by an off-duty police officer, Eric Clegg, who has said himself that he was not driving over the speed limit. Nigel Wally spoke about the incident as he was there when it transpired. Mimi was at the gate with John's mom, who was about to leave. We walked down Menlove Avenue, and I turned off to Vale Road, where I lived. I must have been about 15 yards up the road when I heard a car skidding. I turned around to see John's mom going through the air. I rushed over, but she had been killed instantly. The loss of his mother changed the young musician, and he would later reflect upon it in songs in both the Beatles and his solo works, with notable pieces including Julia, Mother, and most blatantly obvious, My Mummy's Dead. Paul too had lost his mother when he was 14 in 1956, and reflected upon it in songs like Yesterday and more notable, Let It Be, which was written after Paul had a dream wherein his mother, Mary, came to him and told him the title words. Confusion has arisen from this story as some believe that he means the Catholic Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus, but he denied that assumption. Though the date is disputed, the Quarrymen played on TV Star Search as Johnny and the Moondogs on October 18, 1959, with only Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison playing as the band without a drummer, as Colin Hanton left on January 1st. Questioned about the absence of a drummer, they said that, quote, the rhythms and the guitars. Their audition went well, and they qualified for regional finals on November 15th. Although they lost to Sunnyside Skiffle Group, who in 1957 had beaten them as the Connaughts, Johnny and the Moondogs were still liked enough by the judges and qualified to go to the finals that were to be held 2 weeks later at Hippodrome in Manchester. The day of the finals, too, is not completely clear, but is assumed to be on November 15, 1959. Winning the competition would mean a television appearance for Johnny and the Moondogs, but the odds were stacked against them. Being that the majority of their audience was centered in Liverpool, they were not popular enough in Manchester to win the clap-o-meter, which, as the name suggests, judges each act by the audience's response in claps. Knowing that they didn't have a chance to win, the three young men had already gotten on a train back to Liverpool when the judging was underway. Cynthia Powell, John's future wife, had to say about John's perspective on failing in his music endeavors. Their hopes were high, but they came back despoten. They had failed the audition mainly because they lacked a drummer. It was a setback, but it didn't put them off. When something didn't work out, John would be down for a day or so. Then he'd carry on, determined to be the best and to show anyone who didn't believe in the group how wrong they'd been. The last major name change that came before the Beatles was similar, the Silver Beatles. John said that he wanted a name that sounded English. In 1960, Paul McCartney saw the band the Blackjacks playing, and the drummer Pete Best caught his interest. The Blackjacks were on the verge of breaking up, so McCartney suggested to Pete that he come with them on their first tour of Hamburg as their drummer. Best agreed, and his audition was held the next Friday. At that point, the band consisted of Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Stuart Sutcliffe, the band's original bassist. Although they had various drummers throughout their circuit playing in Liverpool, for Hamburg they needed a set drummer at least until their German tours were over, and that's where Best came in. McCartney had also written a letter to another drummer after seeing a classified ad. Drummer, young, free, KP60 Echo. When the drummer got the letter, he called the band's manager, who told him that the Beatles had already left for Hamburg. The letter had been written the same day as Pete Best's audition, and with no time to wait for a response, they took Best with them to Hamburg. Pete's audition was held at their manager's Liverpool club, the Blue Angel, and was chosen because at that point, he was the only reliable drummer that was available to the band. In Anthology, Paul McCartney said, "He was a good drummer, and when Hamburg came up, he joined us. He was a very good-looking guy, and out of all the people in our group, the girls used to go for Pete." Their trip to Hamburg was written in manager Alan Alan Williams' green Austin van and consisted of Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, Sutcliffe, and the new addition Best, as well as Williams, his wife Beryl, her brother Barry Chang, and their friend Lord Woodbine. The last addition to the already cramped van was Herr Steiner, who would act as their translator in Germany, who they picked up in London. From there they drove to Harwich, where they got on a ferry to the Netherlands. Ending up in Arnhem, Netherlands accidentally, the group wandered the city for a while, having time to spare, and while they were there, they were photographed at a World War II memorial, and later John stole a harmonica from a music shop. Alan Williams is quoted saying, "We had time to kill, so we went round the town center and into a music shop, and when we came out, they were all laughing their heads off. I said, 'What's the joke, lads?' And John pulled out a mouth organ. He'd stolen a bloody mouth organ. I thought, Christ, we're never even gonna get to Hamburg. We'll all be in jail. The first time abroad, and he had the audacity to rob a shop." Their first show in Hamburg did not go as well as would be expected. Playing at the Inter Club for the first time on August 17, 1960, they were contracted to play for 48 nights, getting paid £2.50 per person per night, with Alan Williams making £10 in commission per week. Each weekday and Saturday, they had to play for 4.5 and 6 scattered hours, respectively. On the first gig, they were told by the manager to turn their amplifiers down after complaints from the residents above them, and only played to a handful of listeners, chief among them being prostitutes and their clients. Stressed from the new hostile environment, the group played completely still and huddled together for the entire set. After the show, they crowded into the club owner, Bruno Koschmider's flat. In Anthology, George said, "Of course, on the first night we got there weren't any arrangements for anything. The club owner, Bruno Koschmider, drove us around to his house, and we ended up staying, all in one bed. Bruno wasn't with us, fortunately. He left us to stay in his flat for the first night and went somewhere else. Eventually, he put us in the back of a little cinema, the Bambino. We only ever saw him once a week, when we tried to get into his office for our wages." After the first night, Koschmider brought the group to the old cinema that only played old westerns, where the room was behind the screen. Being that before, it was a makeshift bedroom, it was an old storeroom, and there was just concrete walls and nothing else. No heat, no wallpaper, not a lick of paint, and 2 sets of bunk beds, like little camp beds, with not very many covers. As well as poor living conditions, there was also no food at the Bambino, and the Beatles, who didn't have any money when they first came to Hamburg, would frequent the British Sailors Society, where they were given cornflakes and milk for free. After their 48 days playing at the Inter Club in Hamburg, their contract was over, and at that point they had played over 200 hours in Germany. After the Beatles left the Inter, the owner turned it back into a strip club, and the band was sent to play at the larger venue, the Kaiser Keller. The Kaiser Keller was great. At least it had a dance floor, and all the tables and chairs were located inside pieces of ship. The tables were barrels, and there were ropes and nautical things around. The Beatles' contract with Koschmider was terminated after he learned of an agreement the band had made to play at Koschmider's rival, Pete Eckhorn's Top 10 Club, 2 days earlier. Not only had the band betrayed their contract to Bruno, but Harrison, who was still 17, was underage to be working in a club. After being in Hamburg for just over 3 months, the police discovered Harrison's true age on November 20th, and he was deported the next day. That night, he taught Lennon his parts so that they could finish their stage presence in Hamburg before returning to England. I had to go home, and that was right at a critical time, because we had just been offered a job at another club down the road, the Top 10, which was a much cooler club. Here we were, leaving the Kaiser Keller to go to the Top 10, and right at that point, they came and kicked me out of town. So I was moving out to go home, and they were moving out to go to this great club. By the time the young musician returned to Liverpool, he was completely broke, as all of his transportation tickets were paid out of pocket, and upon arriving at his house, he only had, quote, "an amplifier that I bought in Hamburg and a crappy suitcase." On November 1st, when their contract was finally terminated, the group began moving their things to the attic of the Top 10 Club. John and Stewart had already left the Bambino Theater, and Paul and Pete were in the process of moving when George was deported. Needing a light, the two lit a fire to an object still not completely proven. Some sources will say it was a rag, others will say a tapestry, and if you're lucky, you hear they lit a condom on fire that had been nailed to the wall. Although the burn mark on the wall was small, as the damp wall easily stopped the fire from spreading, Koschmider believed that they were trying to burn down the cinema and had them arrested. He told them that we tried to burn his place down, and they said, "Leave, please. Thank you very much, but we don't want you to burn down our German houses." Funny, really, because we couldn't have burned down the place even if we had gallons of petrol. It was made of stone. Two spent the night in St. Pauli police station, and after they were released, they left for the attic of the Top 10 Club to sleep. Awoken in the afternoon by two policemen pounding on the doors, the two Beatles were taken to the Hamburg police headquarters. Later, they would be taken back to the Top 10 to quickly gather their belongings, but Best was forced to leave his drum set. They were kept in jail until midnight when an aeroplane would pick them up and bring them back to London. We tried our best to persuade him it was nothing, and he said, "Okay, fine, well, you go with these men." And that was the last we knew of it. We just headed out with these couple of coppers, and we were getting a bit, oh dear fear this could be the concentration camps. You never know. It hadn't been that long since the war. Since the two Beatles knew very little German, they were still not sure why they were being deported, and they were denied a call to the British Council. When they had made it back to Liverpool on December 1st, 1960, like Harrison when he arrived back home, they had no money left. John and Stewart were the only two remaining Beatles in Hamburg. Lennon would stay for a few more days, and Sutcliffe would stay in Hamburg with Astrid Kirchherr, who photographed many pictures of the band while they were in Germany. Stewart would stay behind and live in Hamburg until February of 1961. In Lennon's last few days, he played various gigs with different bands. His three remaining bandmates who had already made it home to Liverpool didn't learn of Lennon's arrival back in England until he called them on December 15th. They were all deported and I was left in Hamburg, playing alone with another group of musicians. We'd spent our money as we went along. I didn't have any spare, and being stuck in Hamburg with no food money was no joke. When I did get home, I was so fed up I didn't bother to contact the others for a few weeks. He continued, talking about how the whole experience almost drew him away from performing. I just withdrew to think whether it was worth going on with. I thought, is this what I want to do? I was always a sort of poet or painter. Anyway, after a while, I got to thinking that we ought to cash in on the Liverpool beat scene. Things were really thriving, and it seemed a pity to waste the experience we'd got playing all those hours every night in Hamburg. The day that Beatlemania began in Britain can be credited to December 17, 1960. After all leaving Hamburg besides Sutcliffe, the band was in need of a new bassist, the job of which was given to Chas Newby. They performed their first show at the Casbah Coffee Club since their Quarrymen days, the last year on October 10th. They were booked as the Beatles, direct from Hamburg, Germany. Expecting to see a German act, the basement venue was packed to the brim of an ecstatic audience. When the group walked on, spirits quickly dropped as they were obviously not the German act that they expected. In their time in Hamburg, the Beatles act had changed, however. They played phenomenally and brought the crowd's spirit above that of when they had believed they would be treated to a foreign act. On February 9th, the Beatles played at the Cavern Club, another venue they had not played since their Quarrymen days. The performance was the first at the club for both George Harrison and Stuart Sutcliffe, who had rejoined the group when he returned from Hamburg on January 20th. Harrison was almost stopped at the door since he was wearing jeans, a taboo at the Cavern Club, but he convinced the bouncer that he was a performer and was let in. About the Beatles' performance, the Cavern Club owner Spencer Lye said, "They were different and they were very well rehearsed because they had come back from 3 months of torture in Hamburg. The Beatles' music was so vibrant. The February 9th performance netted the group £5 and they split among themselves." After their first performance at the club as the Beatles, the group would play at least another 150 lunchtime and 125 evening shows until their last show on August 3rd, 1963.